So I promised myself the other week that I wasn't going to review another BBC horror show, but here we are. Fortunately though, for me, with this channel dedicated to science fiction, sci-fi has always gone hand in hand with horror. From the day Mary Shelley wrote Frankenstein, there's just been this connection between science fiction and horror. It just works so perfectly. From when we see Boris Karloff playing Frankenstein, through to David Cronenberg making his body horror stuff, Jurassic Park, Red Dwarf, even nowadays with sort of more existential horror we find in the Three Body Problem, science fiction and horror are directly linked to one another. But the thing about that type of horror is that you can put the book down, you can switch the TV off, you can even get up and leave the cinema if you want, and you can go and forget about it. It's very rare that horror has very real world consequences. I am of course talking about the 1992 film Ghostwatch. So on the face of it, if you don't watch Ghostwatch and you just read about it, it's ostensibly a pretty standard poltergeist horror kind of film. But they did something really different with it. The film is set on Halloween night of 1992, and you're told early on that the Earlys have been haunted by this poltergeist since late December of 1991. What they've experienced so far off screen is a classic haunting. It's a ghost, and they call the ghost Pipes because the youngest daughter, Kim, named him that. Apparently it's because it sounds like the noises of the pipes in the house banging away. The mum has asked repeatedly for help off of the local council for a move, and all she got told was go and see a psychiatrist. She appeared on local television, she appeared in local newspapers who all mocked her. No one believed her until a scientist called Dr. Lynn Pascoe, a very, very plausible scientist, I hasten to add. Dr. Lynn Pascoe comes along and offers them help. As Dr. Pascoe investigates further, the haunting seems to get worse. One of the daughters is mutilated, there's breakages, there's banging, and there's all sorts of stuff going on in the house to lead you, the viewer, to really kind of invest in it and think, oh my God, this is real. And it's at this point the BBC get involved, because for one night only, they're going to do a Halloween special. For the first time in British television history, they're going to do a live ghost hunt on television. And it's called Ghostwatch. So the BBC went as far as casting real life television presenters from the era. We've got Michael Parkinson, who is one of the most trustworthy and famous faces on British television. We've got Sarah Green as well. Now, she was a children's television presenter. She used to present the Saturday morning programmes on BBC One, alongside her real-life husband, Mike Smith, who was on studio duties that night. He was manning the telephone lines. And also, now a lot of people say oddly, but it's not very odd at all, because the BBC do this quite often. If they feel like they've got a rising star who's familiar to millions of faces, whether they're actors or presenters, they will use them. So they cast Craig Charles, who was really famous at the time. His star was definitely on the rise because he was starring as Lister in Red Dwarf. They show up with like a full outside broadcast unit, but as it progresses, the haunting gets steadily worse. The programme gets a lot scarier. It gets to the point about 30 minutes in that subtly, sort of in the script, Michael Parkinson has an interaction with a telephone caller, and he's telling the woman, send your children to bed. They shouldn't be watching this programme. For goodness sake, woman, put the children to bed, because this is scary and it's only going to get more scary. And from here, it gets a lot more scary. Progressively, the horror ramps up throughout the show, and you're fed clues as well. You're given little ideas here and there and hints and stuff as to what the backstory of this is and what is really going on. You are taken in varying different directions as well, because the skeptic in you is placated as much as the believer. because you get scenes early on where some banging and rattling's going on and it's all very happy Saturday morning TV-ish going on, and then all of a sudden Craig Charles will jump out of a cupboard wearing a mask trying to scare Sarah Green, who is visibly shaken by it, I have to add. But then other instances will happen where somebody will phone into the studio and say, no, I've seen the ghost, I see pipes there in this bit of film, and you'll see it, they'll play it to you as the audience, and the camera will pan across the room and you can see the outline of pipes in the background. But then when they look at the footage again in the studio, he's not there. So you're left sort of questioning yourself. You're thinking, am I spooking myself up a little bit here? Then some sort of real horror kind of happens in the house. You get a scene where some banging and crashing is happening, and the crew and everybody's genuinely afraid for themselves and for the two children in the house as well. And you'll follow the camera downstairs and you'll see a really sort of spooky row of children's drawings and a kind of like pentagram circle thing going on the floor that is made out of crayons. Then you're introduced to a skeptic, ostensibly on a live feed from New York, having a debate with Dr. Pascoe about it. And I have to add, yet again, Dr. Pascoe is frighteningly plausible. And just when you're starting to really believe, because some weird things are happening in the house, although it has to be said that the specialist ghost hunting team they've got on the outside of the house with all their equipment aren't picking up anything. You'll see just off camera in a corner, one of the daughters is banging on the pipes. And all of a sudden, show over, isn't it? There's no ghost, she's been found out. Dr. Pascoe looks a fool, and so does everybody else in the house. It gets a lot more scary, trust me. As it moves on, you're really drawn into it. There's no odds in it. You forget that this is a film. You think you're watching a live broadcast, and you're given more information about the ghost as well. In the end, what becomes apparent is that because of the nature of this live broadcast and everybody tuning in to watch it, it's making it a national seance, and all of the energy of everybody watching this show is going into pipes and making him more and more powerful. And you're left with a scene of chaos and carnage at the house. And in the studio, things are going absolutely bananas as well. And the show ends with Michael Parkinson reciting a children's fairy tale, the exact one that Pipes used to say. Now, on its own, taken without context, it's a pretty standard paranormal type film. There's not much inventiveness in the plot. It's pretty full of the usual tropes. But what makes this special, and what makes this, I would argue, possibly one of the most influential television programs ever made, is how it was done and the way that you're drawn in as the audience into thinking that it's real. Now, to give a little context to that, in 1992, when this was made, television was king. Nothing could beat television. There was no internet. Video games were, I would say, pretty much in their infancy, although they've been around for about 10 years before that. But everybody watched television. My generation, the generation of television, watched more of it in the 1990s than we ever would ever again, and ever would beforehand. Television was everywhere. It was ubiquitous. And these type of live broadcasts were very trusted. You believed what you were seeing. So when I say television was king, it really, really was. People trusted television more than they trusted their own family sometimes. There's a reason in Britain we give the BBC the nickname of Auntie, and it was fronted by one of the most trusted men in broadcasting, Michael Parkinson. He was like a father figure on television. He'd been interviewing all of Hollywood's A-list celebrities for what felt like a century at that point. Probably weren't quite that long. But he was seen as really reliable. You could trust Michael Parkinson. You know, don't get me wrong. If they had offered the part to Noel Edmonds, who was the king of light entertainment in that period, he would have ripped their arm off for it. But I don't think it would have had as much gravity with him in the studio. Sarah Green as well. Now, I mentioned she was like a Saturday morning children's television presenter. She was loved nationwide. Like, everybody loves Sarah Green. I've got really fond memories of watching her in the mornings and on a Saturday, introducing my favourite cartoons to me and getting up to all sorts of shenanigans on Live and Kicking and going live or whatever it was we was watching at the time. And even the addition of her husband in the studio really added to it as well, because Mike Smith, again, really reliable. You believe these people. They were very plausible. You don't actually see that much of Craig Charles, but what you do see is very well presented and very believable. Again, that word, plausible. It was written by Stephen Volk and directed by Leslie Manning. But the most important thing about this duo, these two really knew the medium they was working in, and they really knew the technical limitations they had, but they utilised these limitations perfectly. Now, it's easy for us to forget in the digital age just how rough it was watching analogue television back in the 90s at times. We forget that those outside broadcasts, and in any broadcast actually, would often have these sort of technical glitches throughout them. And I don't mean it going completely off air and all that kind of stuff. It'd be something as mundane as like a pigeon landing on your aerial or something like that, and your screen would go a bit fuzzy. Or if you lived in a built-up area like I did, you'd often have trouble with your television reception. But they use these throughout the show. They use these glitches to add to the atmosphere of it. They'll be walking down a flight of stairs, for instance, and for no reason you'll get a little bit of fuzzing on the screen. And ultimately what comes from that is that Dr. Pascoe works out that Pipes, because of the energy of this national seance that's being fed into him, he's got into the machine. He's in everybody's television. I actually saw an interview with Stephen Volk, and he turned around and said that they wanted to put these sort of high frequency sounds into the broadcast that was sort of beyond the range of human hearing. But if you had pets, they would hear it and they would be going bananas. And that would add a whole other level of chaos to the night, wouldn't it? So as I said, everybody in this programme is really believable and it's very plausible. And the BBC went to great lengths to draw people into that. And the casting of it as well. Everybody in it is really believable, even though at the time a lot of them had appeared on television programmes elsewhere. I mean, for instance, a few of the actors have been in The Bill, which was a very, very popular police soap opera on the other channel at the time. But casting Parkinson in it was a real coup. Yeah, face value, utterly reliable, completely believable. Parkinson doesn't lie to you. But there's something more subtle going on there as well. So in Britain, we've kind of got this weird bias with accents. The London accent and, well, what we call the estuary accent, so London and the sort of southern counties like Essex and Kent, that accent is seen as sort of a bit unreliable and a bit untrustworthy. It's the reason why a lot of the call centres for like banks and other businesses are sort of placed in the north of England, because the northern accents are seen as far more reliable and a lot more trustworthy, none more so than the Yorkshire accent. And of course, Parkinson, he's got a very, very light, but very, very trustworthy Yorkshire accent about him. Again, a really subconscious way of drawing the viewer in. There's a kind of storytelling rule as well when you're making films or any great piece of art, is that you show and you don't tell. Stanley Kubrick was the master of that. He showed you everything and told you nothing. But this sort of reverses that principle with utter grace and utter poise. You don't really see Pipes in it, and if you do, you get like a few sort of frames of him here and there, or just off the corner of a camera, almost subconscious. Apparently he's in the show 13 times, and yeah, there's videos on YouTube pointing all 13 of those out, but when I rewatched it the other day, I only saw him 3 times, but I could describe him to you. Another thing they do to really draw you in, again, really clever, like I said, they really knew the medium they was working in, was that they advertised it as a drama. It was part of the BBC's Screen One strand, which was their sort of one-off drama series that they was doing throughout the 90s. They gave it a full 2-page special spread in the Radio Times, which is the BBC's own listing and television magazine. They went to lengths to let people know this was a drama. Even at the beginning of the show, it starts with opening credits and it says written by Stephen Vogt, starring Michael Parkinson. But they still had a few tricks up their sleeve to fool you. So again, from my memories of watching television on a Saturday night in the early 90s, television programmes was either 30 minutes or an hour. And on the BBC, they was very, very strict with their scheduling. And this was because, well, the BBC 9 o'clock news at the time and the 6 o'clock news was sacred. You couldn't cross into that territory at all. The BBC broadcast the news dead on 9 o'clock. It also finished at 9:30 because they'd have 5 or 10 minutes worth of local news at the end of it. They also knew that ITV, which was the main rival channel at the time, was showing a film which was due to finish at 9:30. And they knew everybody would be watching that film. It was a big film of the day. Don't ask me what it was, but it would have been something big and Hollywood and the type of thing that you really, really look forward to watching because you only had VHS tapes if you was lucky. But the Schneids at BBC that night decided that Ghostwatch was going to air at 9:25, which meant that the bulk of viewers that was going to tune into it missed the continuity announcer between the two programmes telling everybody that this is a drama, don't be scared. And they also missed those really important opening credits. So they tuned in to what looks like a real BBC paranormal investigation happening live in real time. I cannot overstate the importance of this to the believability and the pull and the overall atmosphere of the programme. Also, throughout the show, you're told there's going to be hourly updates throughout the night. Now, this was a done thing as well in the 90s on the BBC when they made these big outside broadcast events. They would go back and revisit. They done one not too long before it called Hospital Watch, I think it was called. Again, Sarah Green presenting it. Again, more plausible. And they would do this with that kind of thing as well. They would go back and revisit throughout the evening to see what was going on with interesting things that happened within the show. You also had it as well with Crime Watch. Crime Watch would come on, it'd be on for an hour, and then there'll be like a 10-minute update as well later on in the evening. But if you looked at your issue of the Radio Times, you'd have seen that the programme was, well, it was only an hour and a half long. So how could they go back and revisit it throughout the evening? Because it wasn't scheduled, it wasn't there. The trouble is, what's the circulation of the Radio Times? I mean, I couldn't tell you that now. I mean, at most 100,000 or something like that at the time, because there was other listings magazines available. The point I'm trying to make is that although the BBC advertised it and was quite clear in their advertising that this was a drama, it was also not very clear at the time, which had, I think, some very, very, very sad consequences. So as the show finished, again, the continuity announcer said this was a drama. And the reason for that was simple. Throughout the show, they advertised a telephone number for you to call into. Now, I can recite that number off the top of my head because it's the number you used to use to ring the BBC whenever they had a competition or something, especially if you was watching Going Live, which was the programme at the time Sarah Green presented. You'd ring in to talk to your favourite pop star or something, or enter a competition. And that number is 081 811 8181. It's just ingrained in my memory, as it would be to anybody who watched British television throughout the 90s. But therein lies a big problem, because people flooded the BBC with phone calls. They jammed the switchboard with their own paranormal stories that they wanted to get on television because they thought it was real. Now, if you'd have got through to that number, you would have been greeted with a recorded message saying, hey, if this is only a drama, this isn't real, don't have nightmares. But with like 30,000 calls coming in, that BBC 1992 switchboard just ain't cutting it, and nobody is getting to hear that message. In fairness though, if you think you wouldn't have been taken in by this, I'm going to remind you, people in the 1990s, 1980s, 1950s, Victorian era, believe it or not, they were everything as sophisticated as we are nowadays. It had this mystical power about it. And I'm not going to argue that 100% of people watching it believed it 100%. It was probably far less than that. But I'm arguing that a lot of people did believe it. And in a way, that was the real magic and mystery of the show. The sort of way it highlighted the way that television had this kind of hold over people, and people believed everything they saw on the screen. In its way, it's almost like a satire, really, of the state of culture in the early 90s. It had this kind of realistic feel about it that was really hard for you in 1992 to separate. I sort of believed it because I was 5. My sister believed it because she was like 11. My mum should have known better, but she likes to believe in this sort of thing. And yet there were some pretty comical outcomes from it. There was the famous incident of a former soldier whose wife wrote in to claim compensation from the BBC because he had soiled his trousers that night and she wanted them to pay the cleaning bill. Aha, very funny. Is it though? In 1994, it made medical history because it was the first known incident of a television programme being directly responsible for at least 2 children requiring treatment for PTSD. Now, I'm going to wear my earnest cap for this bit, but PTSD is just a really horrific mental condition. It's horrible. And I don't think that should be forgotten when we're talking about this. 2 children were treated for this. Now, yes, we can argue that it was way past the watershed, which is the 9 p.m. shut off on British television. So after 9 p.m, it's sort of anything within reason goes, but before 9 p.m, it's got to be kiddie friendly. Okay, so kids shouldn't have been watching it. But even so, the power of this television program was that great. It caused real well kind of harm to these children. And then finally, but perhaps most tragically, now, a young man was watching this program. He was 18 years old. He's been described as a slow learner. And the parents say that he was sort of mesmerised by the show. And he's obsessed with ghosts, that's why he was watching it. And tragically, a few weeks after the broadcast, he unalived himself. Now, I'm not saying that this program is directly responsible for this. That'd be wrong for me to say that. But he left some information in his note to the effect that he believed in ghosts and that he wanted to be a ghost so he could be with his parents forever. The family to this day don't watch anything by the BBC and refuse to watch anything with Michael Parkinson in it, and I don't blame them. But it's important for me to state as well that I'm not directly attributing this poor young man's demise to Ghostwatch. But at the beginning of this, I said it's possibly one of the most influential television programs of all time. And I said that because it's true. Now everybody goes, yeah, Most Haunted, that definitely come out of it. Yeah, absolutely. You wouldn't have Most Haunted without Ghostwatch. Absolutely. The entire found footage genre, I don't think wouldn't really exist without Ghostwatch. Mind you saying that, again, I don't think Ghostwatch could have been made without Quatermass. But hey, in terms of television, Ghostwatch is absolutely one of the most influential things ever. I've seen interviews with the writer of it and the director, and they've said they get letters and emails and they talk to their friends and colleagues who teach media studies at university. And 31 years later, there's at least 1 or 2 people on the course that want to do Ghostwatch for their dissertation. These people will go on to work within the television industry and the film industry. So vicariously, its influence goes that way. But again, I think its influence is far greater than that, and in a way, far more insidious than that. What Ghostwatch did is it took away the mystique of television, and it took away its power almost. It completely deflated it, because straight away afterwards, everybody was a bit more cynical. Yeah, again, I mentioned Most Haunted, fine. But I certainly think we wouldn't get sort of scripted documentaries the way we do nowadays. I'm thinking about Love Island, I'm thinking about The Only Way is Essex, in America probably Jersey Shore, things like that. Even Top Gear, such was its power. It changed the landscape of at least factual entertainment for, well, it's been 31 years now. It even went to Hollywood. Because, I've got to admit, last night, Halloween's coming up, I decided to introduce my daughter, Little Miss Sci-Fi, to the Blair Witch Project. Again, I just don't think we'd have that without Ghostwatch. The question is though, does television still have that power over us? Does it have the power to thrill us the way it does? Well, I just argued that we're no more sophisticated now as people than we was in the 1990s, although we're far more technologically sophisticated. Could you do Ghostwatch again though? Would people buy into it? Well, to a certain degree, yes, you could do it again. The BBC did so with a special episode of Inside Number 9 called Deadline. If you haven't seen Inside Number 9, check it out, because it's probably the best thing the BBC are making at the moment. It's Steve Pemberton, Reece Shearsmith of League of Gentlemen fame. They do a horror, drama, comedy, anthology series. Deadline deserves its own episode, so I won't go too deeply into it. But they perfectly revisited the concept. I watched it live, it's a Halloween special, and I'm not going to miss out on a Halloween special of Inside Number 9 because it is outstanding. And I was drawn in by it. I was watching it and I was getting annoyed. I thought the signal was cutting out. I was going, I was going to go and switch over to the live stream on iPlayer and all that kind of stuff. And then about 10-15 minutes into the show, you start to realise what they're doing, because you've seen Ghostwatch. So, yeah, you could do it, but you couldn't hold it. You couldn't hold the mystique for that entire hour and a half. On its own though, Ghostwatch, it's brilliant. Now, I've been rewatching it for researching this video, and I actually do think it stands up really good as a one-off drama, without all the magic, so to speak, of it being a live show, and without the context of it. It still holds up really well. It's still a very good ghost story. It's still a very good horror, and it's still really, really well done. And young people nowadays, sounding my age, are very, very cynical. But I showed it to Little Miss Sci-Fi because she's sort of old enough now. She's 12. She knows the difference between reality and fiction. And she thoroughly enjoyed it. She was thrilled by it. She was scared by it. But importantly though, for 1 minute think it was real. So in short, it's still worth watching. And you can get it on DVD. It was sort of put into the memory hole by the BBC as well, because it caused them so much drama, it caused them so much aggravation afterwards. They sort of buried it. And in 2002-ish, like the 10 years was coming around, the internet was a thing by then, and it sort of had a little bit of a head of steam about it. So they released it on DVD with some director's commentary and whatnot. Fun fact actually, Stephen Volk actually wrote a sequel to it, which you can download for free off of his personal website as a PDF. It's actually pretty good. So if you made it this far, thanks for watching my video. I would say please don't have nightmares, but only a prick could say something like that. So just thank you for watching my video. If you liked it, please hit the like button, please subscribe.